Last week, we looked at the story of Josiah, King Josiah, one of the most important kings in Israelite history. He played a crucial part in one of the most important moments in Israelite history, period in Israelite history, in God's history. And we asked the question to ourselves, how can we know? How do we know when we are living through God's moment? How do we know we are living through a historical moment, that God is doing something big, that God is moving in a mighty way? We found 2 clues that I think could help us perceive how God is moving in our world and in our time, how his story matches up with our stories and intersects. The first was that we need to be brilliant in the basics, you might remember. Some of you don't. I'll be honest, I had to double check the points from last week's sermon. But the first point was that we need to be brilliant in the basics, that we need to be faithful in the small things. Because when we are faithful in those small and simple things that seem inconsequential, then God is faithful in the bigger things. And we also saw that when God moves, he wants everyone to be involved, that he wants everyone to be invited to his party, to his banquet, his feast. It is not closed off for a secret, select, elite few, but it is open to the entire world. And there were a couple more points that I think we can find through Josiah's life and his reign. But we didn't have enough time last week, so today I want to look at 2 more clues that I think can help us discover what is God's moment. How is God moving? And the first clue, I think, comes from Josiah's personal life, his personal background. You might remember last Sunday we mentioned that Josiah was only 8 years old. He was 8 years old when he took over as king. So when he put in these reforms in his 18th year, he was only 26 years old. And he was 8 years old when he took over as king, and he had a good reign. He had a long reign. He made many important religious reforms, as we read about. But we have to ask ourselves, was Josiah destined for success? Was he destined for success? Was it programmed into his DNA? Was that the only path that he could have chosen? Was it just meant to be that Josiah would do this work? Was it his bloodline that made him a good candidate to be king? I mean, obviously we know his bloodline. He is from royal blood. That's the only way you can be king. But was it his bloodline that made him a good king? You might notice it says that he did what was right in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Lord. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Let us always strive to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Not in the eyes of the world, not in the eyes of our friends or even our family, but in the eyes of the Lord. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And it says he followed completely the ways of his father David, turning aside neither to the left nor to the right. But who exactly was Josiah's father? Because Josiah's birth father was not David. It was not David. Josiah's father was King Amon. And Amon was so wicked that it says after only 2 years in charge as king of Israel, his own advisors assassinated him. His own counselors, the people closest to him, his inner circle, killed the king. And that was the reason that Josiah took over when he was only 8 years old. But there was someone even worse than Amon. And that was his father, King Manasseh. And this was Josiah's grandfather, King Manasseh. Now, we all know the story of Elijah. We know about King Ahab and Jezebel and how wicked they were. They're considered the most wicked rulers that Israel had ever seen. They were a power couple, right? But the only person in Israelite history who can match Ahab, who is right next to him in that list of worst kings ever, was Manasseh. They're known in both Christianity and Judaism. If you ask a Christian or a Jew who are the two worst kings in Israelite history. They will tell you Ahab and Manasseh. And Manasseh, it says that he followed all the evil practices of the neighboring religions, the neighboring countries. And it says that he set up altars to foreign gods, to Baal and Asherah, Moloch, all these other false gods, and he put them not in his palace, not in the town square, but it says he put them in the temple. He put them in the temple that Solomon had built, the holy resting place of God. He placed those altars inside the temple. I mean, if you think about what, evil thing this is to do. And it says he practiced divination. He believed in omens and mediums and spiritists and greatly aroused the anger of the Lord. He just went down the list. Every single thing that could have made God unhappy, Manasseh was doing it. But that wasn't even the worst thing that he did. Manasseh is known for something else. The Bible tells us that God is a jealous God. It's in the Ten Commandments, that we shall serve God and none other. And the Bible often tells us not to worship idols, not to chase after these false gods. But there was one practice that was especially abhorrent to the God of Israel. And that was the practice of child sacrifice. The worship of the foreign idol Moloch involved child sacrifice. And whenever God told his people not to follow idols, it lists them all out, but it specifically points out child sacrifice as the one thing that God does not desire from his people. It was the worst possible offense against God. God said, this is an offense against me to put your own child on the altar. And we have to reread the story of Abraham and Isaac, because we read it and we often think it's a story about how God provides to the faithful, that when we are faithful, God will provide something else. But the story also is a very, very clear indication that God does not want child sacrifice, because it was common among that time in those people. But God does not want child sacrifice from his people. But Manasseh is known as the king who sacrificed his own children, sacrificed them in the fire, burning them alive to please this false god, Moloch. That was Josiah's grandfather, his 친할아버지, right? That's the kind of family that Josiah came from. He was raised not in a gracious and God-fearing, God-loving family, but he was raised in this kind of household, a broken household, one that had fallen into the most wicked, most despicable behavior. So I think the first clue in this is that when God chooses someone to do a mighty work, when God chooses someone for his grand moments, he does not consider their family history. He does not consider their personal background. And I think this is truly, truly amazing grace, isn't it? It's amazing grace that the sins of the father and the mother are not passed down to the son and the daughter. Because if they were, then how many of us here would be worthy to stand before God, to stand in his service? You do not have to come from the right family. You do not have to come from the proper line to be used by God, to be his child, to be his servant. We don't need the right connections. Our pastor emeritus, Wollo 목사님, he often talks about how his father used to abuse him. His father would just beat him senseless for no reason. And I still remember he said once that when his father got a certain look in his eye, his mother told him to run away because she knew that he would kill him. He would go into a rage and he would take out his anger on his young son. There's no way that an uneducated and uncivilized farmer man like this, living in the countryside, knowing nothing, could have a son that would grow up to be a world-recognized and respected pastor. And I think our senior pastor said it best when he said, no one trained him, no one groomed him to become who he is. 누가 키워주지 않았어요. He was simply chosen by God. Because when God is doing a big thing, it goes beyond human conditions. It goes beyond human relationships and circumstances. God sees people differently. But I also think it's possible to make the mistake of thinking that this means coming from a good background, that coming from a certain line means that it's undesirable. It doesn't mean that you have to come from a bad family. It doesn't mean you have to come from a bad line. It doesn't mean if you're well connected that somehow God cannot use you. I don't think it means that by any means. I'm a PK, a pastor's kid. And, when I tell people I'm a PK, they say, I'm sorry. Because that has a lot of baggage, a lot of emotional and spiritual weight behind it. Because it's not easy being a pastor's kid. And, I spent a lot of my youth really hating who I was. And I hated who my father was and the work that he did. I couldn't stand it. And I wrestled with this for so many years. But now I realize how much wisdom, how much knowledge, how much know-how was passed down to me just by being next to my father, just by watching him do his ministry over the years. Just a couple of weeks ago, while I was in Brazil, we had a guest speaker come here. And he is an MK. He's a missionary's kid. And in a lot of ways, he struggled with his identity too. But hearing his testimony through that sermon about how he followed his father to Honduras in obedience. Well, he didn't have much choice. He had to go. But he followed his father, right? Because when a missionary goes to the mission field, they're not alone, but their family goes with them, and their family also becomes missionaries, whether they like it or not. But he wrestled with this, but as I heard his testimony, I realized how blessed he was to have this experience, to go to Honduras, one of the most dangerous countries in the world, and to spread the gospel in that nation. Coming from the right line, the right family, can be a blessing, but it's never a requirement. That's the point. It's never a requirement. And in some ways, I think, people outside our church are talking a lot about requirements and being the right person for the job. But they fail to realize this point, that being someone's son does not make you the right person for a job. But being someone's son does not make you the wrong person for that job either. That's an important distinction. That is God's grace and his power, his providence, that he can use both the right person and the wrong person. People who come from a good family, people who come from a bad family. People born to the right father and mother, people born to the wrong father and mother. God can use all of them for his purpose, for these moments in his story. There are a lot of us here who come from very good families, right? They say 못해시나, right? When I was young, I didn't really know what it meant. I thought it meant 못된 신앙, right? But a lot of us, we come from 못된 신앙, and it's a blessing to us. It's a blessing to us to grow up in the church, to grow up with God-fearing mothers and fathers. But some of us came from bad families. Some of us came from families where still no one believes, right? I know there are probably people here, during Chuseok, they're like an island of the gospel among their family, all by themselves. There are people living like that. And for many of us, we come from somewhere in between those two extremes. We fall somewhere in the middle. But God can use all of us. And God has a good plan for all of us. God has prepared good works for all of us to do. He's prepared it in advance. And what I see in our church today, I see a great and humble servant of God that has been called to serve. And he has all the tools that are necessary to do the job faithfully. Not because he's someone's son or not because he's not someone's son, but because God has gifted him and God has called him to this ministry and placed his blessing and provision upon him. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. You're following me, right? But how is it? How is it that Josiah was able to break this cycle? If you think about it, this was a generational habit, a generational cycle of sin that his family had fallen into. But how did Josiah break that cycle that had run through his family for so many years? How was he able to go down a different path from his father and his grandfather before him and go back to the path of his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather David? How was he able to do those things, to undo the evil things that had been done before him? In the second part of our reading, we see what happens immediately after Josiah and the priests and the elders and all the common people of the land, right? We read last week. They came together, they read the Bible, and they prayed, they repented, they cried out, they renewed the covenant, and they dedicated themselves to God again. But immediately following that, it says that the young king commands the priests to go into the temple and to remove anything and everything associated with Baal and Asherah and all these other idols, these false gods. And it says that they took the articles dedicated to Baal and Asherah and completely destroyed them. They burned them up. And a lot of these items would have been made with precious metals, with precious jewels. They could have been worth quite a lot if they had been sold. But Josiah, in his wisdom, he did not make the same mistake that King Saul had made. If you remember, King Saul was rejected by God as king over Israel because instead of destroying the Amalekites completely, as commanded by God, it says he brought back the best of the sheep, the best of the cattle to be sacrificed. That was his excuse. But God, I brought it back for you, to sacrifice it at your altar because we want to glorify you. But I think he couldn't bear the thought of wasting this good livestock. I'm sure he had in his mind that, we'll sacrifice some and some will go to us. It was akaw, to throw away all these sheep and cows, cattle. But Josiah, it says, got rid of everything in the temple that was not dedicated to their one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because it didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere in their land, in their nation. And it says there was also a section of the temple where prostitutes were living and working. These shrine prostitutes. Can you imagine this? The temple of the Lord, his house, his resting place, planned by David, built by Solomon, ordained by God. This holy temple had prostitutes living there. During that time, another common practice was not just child sacrifice, but it was also ritual prostitution. Because the religions of the countries that surrounded Israel required prostitutes as part of its worship. And the worshiper would pay to have sex. And then this money would be dedicated to the false god, right? And they considered this worship. So you can see the kind of setting that Israel was in. These were the religions surrounding this nation. And so Josiah ordered everything to be torn down. And he said, grind it down to dust, to powder, so that nothing remains. He didn't want, 2 sticks left together. He said, grind it down to powder and then scatter it over the graves of the common people. Scatter it over the graves. And this wasn't done to dishonor the dead people because they were poor. But these graves were considered unclean. By Jewish law, if anything dead is unclean. So Josiah, when he commanded this, he was saying, even the dust must be made unclean so that no Israelite can ever even touch it again. That is the extent to which Josiah just wiped everything away. Wiped it, made it clean. But it wasn't just the objects that Josiah got rid of. It says he did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. He got rid of the idolatrous priests. He got rid of the people, not just the things, but he got rid of the people that were enabling and engaging in this idolatrous activity. Our senior pastor talked about relationships this past Friday. And he made a very important point that although we are called to love everyone, we are not called to be close to everyone. We are not called to be friends with everyone, because it's very important who we choose to be close to. Who we are close to has a very, very big influence on us, spiritually speaking. So we have to be close only with those who can build us up, who can encourage us and push us on in the faith, not those who will tear us down and drag us back. Josiah knew that these priests could not be allowed to stick around. He could not let them stay anywhere even near the temple. So he tells all of them to leave. And he didn't just stop there, but it says he went out into the countryside, right? It didn't just stop in Jerusalem. It went out from Jerusalem, it says, into the countryside, into all the towns of Israel to destroy the high places. The high places were centers of idol worship. And he got rid of even those. This was a complete cleansing of Israel from the filth that had infiltrated it over the years. This is known as Josiah's reform. And in these actions, I think we can see our second clue, that when God is moving in a mighty way, there's no room for anything else. If you want God to move in a mighty way in your life, you have to make room. There's no room for anything but God. There's a reason that Jesus said no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other. You will serve one, follow one, but you cannot do both. Amen. You will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And in that context, he was talking about money, but we know that money is not the only thing that this world has to offer us, the only thing that can distract us, not the only temptation that is presented to us. It goes beyond just money. If we are really on the lookout for God's moments, for the ways that God is moving, I think we have to sort out our lives first. We have to sort out our lives. And I think Korean has a great word for this that English cannot really match, but it's 정리. 정리. You have to 정리 your life a little bit, right? And I know technically it could be clean, but I think it has a deeper meaning than that, right? We have to clean our lives. We can come from a wicked family. We can have a father and mother that did not follow God. But that doesn't mean we can just continue on in that wicked behavior and expect something to happen. If your father was a drunk, you can't just keep on drinking, right? And say, well, God's grace is going to use me. If your mother was a gambler, you can't go to the casino and ask for God's will to be shown to you. Maybe you're hoping God's will is for you to win. But when we expect God to move, we have to make room. Because there is no room for anything else except God when he moves. Josiah came from a father and a grandfather that had fallen deep, deep into idol worship, into wickedness. But to fully serve the one true God, he had to completely wipe away any trace of these idols from the entire country, not just Jerusalem, but out into the countryside. He went way out to all the towns, and said we need to get rid of every single trace, every object, every person, every place that is enabling this idol worship. He got rid of the objects, the peoples, and the places. And if you think about your own life, think about your life. What are the objects that are leading you astray, the things that are leading you astray? Who are the people that are tearing you down and holding you back from building your faith? Where are the places that are tempting you to sin? We need to sort these things out as we wait for God to move in a mighty way. Before we can do that, there's not really much that we can expect from God. We need to sort ourselves out first. We have to make space. We have to clean away these idolatrous things. All of us here, we want to be a part of God's history. We want to be a part of God's story. We want to be a part of something special, don't we? Especially the younger generations. They feel that they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. But God wants us to be a part of his story. That is his desire. He wants us to be a part of his story. So as we keep an eye out for that, as we look out for how God is moving, let us remember the clues that we learned from the story of Josiah these past couple of weeks. That when we are on the lookout for a big moment in God's story, we have to be brilliant in the basics. We have to be faithful in the small things. We have to remember that God's movement, God's moments are open to all who will accept it, all who are open to that invitation. We have to recognize that God does not discriminate based on human restrictions, based on human standards. And we must make sure that our personal lives are not the obstacle standing in the way of the work that God is doing. These are the clues that Josiah shows us in his life's work. And just as Josiah was used in a great way by God, we are all called to be used in a great way by God, to do big things for God's kingdom. Amen. Amen. Amen.